Well, Australia's defence officials have been talking with their US counterparts today in the hopes that the United States want an Australian warship for the operation in the Red Sea to be changed. Now, a tweaked request might offer political relief for the government because they were facing pressure over their hesitation to answer the appeal for a ship, and the suggestion now is that we'd send more Defence Force personnel instead. But the fact is, the only reason the US is looking to modify its request is because Albanese refused to send them a ship. I'm joined now by Strategic Analysis Australia's Marcus Hellyer. Marcus, welcome. Why has Albanese been so reticent to send a ship to the Red Sea?
Well, I think it's basically because we don't have many ships available. I think we've sort of reached the point where the failure of the previous government's naval shipbuilding program has culminated. And the fact is we only have 3 modern warships. We have 8 older ships, but they're quite small. They don't carry a lot of missiles. And in an environment like the Red Sea, where the Houthis are firing lots of missiles and lots of killer drones at Allied warships, those older Royal Australian Navy ships could be quite vulnerable. So we don't actually, at the moment, have a lot of good options.
Let's just for a moment put aside the Red Sea, but what does it say about our defence capability that we either don't have enough boats or we don't have good enough boats to send over there right now? I mean, should we be worried ourselves about our own capability if something were to go down in our waters or waters closer to us?
I think we should be very worried. So we have 3 modern warships, the air warfare destroyers. They're pretty capable ships, but they're the only vessel that can really defend a task force or indeed an Australian city from missile attacks. So we want to keep them close to home. And the other issue is there's the so-called 3-for-1 rule with military capability, which says if you have 3 of anything, that means you can reliably deploy 1 of them. So from our 3 modern warships, we can probably reliably deploy 1. So I don't think it's a very good situation. And if we look into the future, the first new warship isn't scheduled to be delivered until around 2033, so that's a decade away. And the first AUKUS submarine, if we cross our fingers and hope really hard that that delivers on time, we're still nearly a decade from getting the first nuclear submarine as well. So for the next decade, we're dependent on what we have already in the Navy, and that's already looking pretty thin.
I mean, where have our defence ministers been for the last decade or so? I mean, we've got a rising China, we know that. One of our closest allies calls us up and says, look, can we have a boat for 5 minutes? And we're like, no, we don't have anything. How do we get into this position?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of blame that can go around. We can point at the current government, but they essentially inherited a shipbuilding situation left by the previous government. We can point to some bad decisions made by senior officials in the Defence Department. There's been quite a few very interesting documents released recently that highlighted Defence's poor decision-making. Excuse me. But the bottom line is we missed the opportunity 7 or 8 years ago to keep building air warfare destroyers. We built 3, they're good ships. We could have kept building them, yet we stopped and decided to build a completely new class of ship, the Hunter frigates, which are still a decade away. So, you know, the bottom line is the world out there doesn't really care that we've made bad decisions. It's not going to stop doing what it's doing. The Houthis don't care. They're going to keep doing what they're doing in the Red Sea. So we've wasted a decade or more, and now we're paying the price.
Maybe that was part of that conversation that Albanese had with Xi Jinping. He didn't come out with much else. So sorry, Mr. Xi, could you hold off for a few years while we build the ships? But just going back to the Red Sea, what does this mean for our relationship with the US? They've made what would on the face of it seem a pretty reasonable request. We're talking about one of the most important trade routes in the world. It's in our interest as much as it's in the interest of the US to defend that. We haven't been able to come through with what they've asked for. What kind of message does that send to our allies?
Well, it's not a good look, but Australia and the US have a very long relationship. Australian governments of both sides of politics have a long record of carefully negotiating with the US a sort of acceptable contribution that allows the US to say we've got a coalition contribution from the Aussies. And, we sort of specialise in deploying forces that are good enough to keep the Americans happy but won't cost us too much in terms of blood and treasure. And so I suspect in this case we'll find a face-saving compromise that will keep both sides happy. But will that actually put a real warship in the Red Sea, protecting trade and shooting down Houthi missiles and drones? No.
Just quickly, the suggestion is that what we would send instead is personnel. How many people might we send and what would they be doing?
Well, there's always lots of options. So one of the good things about Australia and the US's military relationship is we work very closely together. We understand each other. So Australian officers can plug quite quickly into US headquarters and take on responsible roles operating headquarters. So I'm sure the US will be happy to take 5, 10 or 20, whatever the number is, of Australian personnel and find useful work for them to do.
Marcus Hellyer, thank you so much for your time. Merry Christmas.